Okay, so today we're going to do a little demo on more of a painterly approach to this copy project for how to do the background with the trees. I've done sort of a mimicry of your underpainting with your burnt sienna, which I think is what you used for yours. I mixed a little bit of a darker umber in and started building up some of the shadows just to push the trunk forward to begin with. And you can see I've used a little bit of white to start bringing forward just a few of our highlights in advance. First thing I'm going to do, I notice a really bright, beautiful, like golden glaze across everything in your research image. So I put a little bit of a like ochre or yellow into a glazing medium. You can see how transparent it is from where I swiped it on the side, so you can check. And then I've covered the entire thing on that, but I'm especially focusing on the trunk and anywhere that in the research image it has that glow. There are a couple areas in the background that certainly are more yellow. Some areas are more brown. Make sure we're focusing on that. Then I'm going in with a little bit of that umber. I'm mixing a little bit of ochre into it to just re-emphasize that beautiful glow that this whole painting has. And we're bumping up our shadows again. I'm painting around the trunk, and I'm also sort of painting around where some of those highlights I already laid in are, and I'm using a filbert so it has a nice soft edge and I can kind of buff it out so that we don't have any hard brush strokes. Right now it's going to look really stark because that tree trunk is going to be unpainted essentially, so it's going to make it look like it's just floating there being terrifying, but we will work on that in a little bit. We're going to focus on the background first. I've also left out any of the smaller branches, the little trailing ones. I'm focusing on the big shapes here, knowing that I can add those back in later on top. It is acrylic. We can always go back and add things in. So I'm doing a couple of the shadows that you can see. They're kind of to the center or the sides of the trunk. I picked the one that's right next to the statue to base this on a little bit. There are some shadows. They essentially sit towards the side center. It's got a bit of a rim light around both sides. So I am blocking in a few of those shadows so that we do start to have a little bit of shaping in 3D to the trunk itself. That's Yuki. You can hear him as per usual. So I've mixed some greens. Here I'm using some of that umber mixed in with a green to help dampen it for our darkest shadows. And I'm using a really stiff, kind of crappy brush that I have to do some stippling in for the under, like laying in shadows, but I'm letting them expand underneath bigger than where just the shadows are, so they take up a lot of space. It allows me to paint my highlights on top of it later and gives this nice like deep receding shadow on the back. So this is going into all the areas that we want a little bit of texture. We want those like leafy textures to show through, and where we want to build up some of the dimension and the shape of the like clumps of leaves. As you can see, I'm also blocking it into a few of the areas that are less defined. They're not really clumps of leaves, but they certainly seem to have some kind of greenery in the distance. And sometimes I'm using my hand or a towel to smudge them in so that they get a little bit of like a softer edge. You could also buff them with a large, clean, damp brush if you wanted to be a little cleaner painter than I am. I've got a bit of water mixed into my paint here so that it's covering a little further and I'm keeping some of that transparency. But when I'm stippling, I'm using medium. If I want it to be a little softer, I can add more medium because then that will kind of fade all together. If I want it to be more intense, like what I'm going to do right here, I'm going to leave medium more out of it because I don't want this to be transparent. I want it to sit on top and have a nice kind of presence. So I've added a little white, a little yellow, a little ochre to get that yellow, and then that felt too bright, so I've added a touch of burnt sienna to tone it down. So that neutral color helps kind of just bring it back into our world so nothing feels too poppy. I'm using a stippling motion or a patting motion, and you'll notice that I rotate my brush as I work so that you don't get the same shape over and over and over again. So every once in a while I just sort of change what shape or what direction I'm holding it in. You can also achieve this by rotating your painting, but usually it's easier to just rotate the brush in your fingers. You can change where you hold it, either closer to the ferrule down by the brush tips or up at the top too if you want it to seem a little bit more organic. Often if we move our hand back and hold it closer to like the tippy tip of the brush, you'll get more like random brush strokes because you have less control. So here I'm using, instead of the flat side of the brush, I'm using the edge. Sometimes I'll tilt it up so I'm using it like blunt face down. Sometimes I'll lay it more sideways. You get bigger strokes that sort of have a fan effect. So keep changing how you're holding the brush and what angle you're doing it at. If I want something to have a really nice soft diffused feeling, I stipple in and then stipple it a little bit with my finger, blot it with my finger, and you can see how that just nicely like multiplies the effect and also fades it out. So we've built up those nice highlights on top of those darker areas, and we're starting to get some very good shape here. There are some areas in the background that are lighter overall, which is what I'm starting to build in this top right corner, where we're going to want to eventually add in some branches and things like that. But knowing we're going to add those in later, we're going to start building in this sort of modeled background that they can live against, that has a nice sense of light to it. So I've used essentially 2 colors of green, a really dark one and then that yellow, very yellow green. I want to make a third that's kind of a smoky, it has a lot of white in it and it's very cool toned. It has a little bit more blue in it as well. And it makes sort of a nice mid-tone, but also a nice softening edge for like the trailing of where things kind of head into shadows. Because it's cooler, it doesn't feel as much like a highlight. It feels like kind of an edge of wistfulness that kind of heads off into the shadow. So the coolness helps it recede, and we always want, at least, especially when working in greenery, I like 3 to 5 different colors of green mixed in to create a nice landscape. And I pay attention to what tones of them. Are they more yellow? Are they more blue? But always making sure to add just a little bit. I tend to add just a little bit of burnt sienna or a little bit of brown or something to just help neutralize them a little bit so they don't feel like they're, you know, primary green. They don't look like you're hanging out in a kid's room. So I've got a little bit of glazing medium and a brighter green tone, and I'm adding in a few washes to the background to start unifying it. I've let this dry for just a second, and we're going to start working on some detail work. So this is where we start adding in the actual little tiny branches that we've been avoiding up until now and connect those little bunches of leaves that we built, and now they need to look like they're actually growing from the tree. So I've mixed ochre, white, and a little tiny bit of brown and a little tiny bit of green. And I've got my rigger brush, which is the really long kind of dancey one with a fine point. I've put a little bit of medium in this. You don't have to, but it helps it travel in order to pull out these nice fine little branches. One thing that helps me remember how to paint branches is that like there's often a bend right before they branch off. So there's like usually a little shift in direction before a new branch goes off in a new direction. So that kind of helps me remember to keep little tiny shifts, not straight lines, and not too curvy either. Though this one does have, your research image has a few that are like very willowy. They bend over and head towards the ground. In a few of the areas there's also, so those were all lighter by comparison to their background. They were like a highlight branch that sits on top. In this section, there are some that are darker than the background that's behind them. So the background is kind of a medium tone of like green and haze. And then there are some darker brown branches that are silhouetted against it. So just to be able to add a little practice to that, we'll put some of those in here as well. And carry that shadow down the center of the trunk. I have a little medium in it that I'm using to feather it out and create nice texture for the bark. And then I'm also making sure to bump up the shadows that are sort of framing the trunk that help bring it forward. So anytime I add a darker shadow in one area, I want to darken the shadows in multiple areas so that they create balance. Or else that one branch would feel really dark. So I've got my little tiny flat brush, a little bit of medium and some yellow, and I'm using that to kind of soften the contrast between those dark lines we just put in, the highlights we already had painted, and sort of unify them a bit. This top layer of color going over it is a little translucent because of the medium that's in it, so it just helps soften everything underneath it and kind of marry them together. I'm also going to use a touch of that stippled over a few of our brighter highlights to soften those as well. Whenever we use medium while we're stippling, it means that it's going to dry with a lot less punch than it looks like when you're putting it down. So that's something important to keep in mind. The medium looks white when it's mixed and when it's wet, but as it dries, it does lose that and it loses its opacity. So it's nice for like very soft, beautiful effects or just tinting something down. It's great for layering up in these builds of like multiple colors that we're working on. But sometimes it can be a little sad if you walk away and come back and it's dried down and you're like, oh, I thought that was very present and now it's kind of a whisper. Adding a few more of those dark little branches at the top, and you saw that I used the brush in the same color to add a few shadows within the actual clumps of leaves as well. And I'm using that color to bump a shadow underneath some of the paler branches that I worked on. And then I'm using my flat brush or my filbert brush here with a little bit of water to just soften those so it doesn't look like a line that's right underneath it, a shadow line, but like making it more of a gradient that's underneath it. It helps make those little light branches feel like they have some dimension and some presence if they have a little dark shadow underneath them or next to them as well. One spot you can see that is kind of that little forked one coming out of the bundle of leaves on the left-hand top side. I keep trying to shift my light during this to get that glare off of it, but it's hard with acrylics. I'll do a little close-up at the end as well. So we've built those branches sort of off and over the distant right side that we currently are naked. This has a different proportion of leaves on it, so these seem like they're much closer. They also feel like they have maybe a different type of leaf, maybe it's a maple tree or something. These seem larger by comparison and more spaced out. So instead of little clumps of soft leaves, I've got a very small pointed round brush. I'm loading it up with a fairly yellow and white mix. I want the white to be in there to help it be opaque, but also to help cool the yellow. And I'm kind of blotting little random shapes vaguely around the branches that look like leaves. I'm rotating my brush randomly to help get different colors down and different opacities, and I'm also changing what direction they face and how I'm holding my brush to help increase that variance. Now I've switched and added some that are darker towards the bottom, which is pulled straight from the research image where they overlap. There's like a section that's very dark leaves and a section at the top that's lighter. And then I'm pulling my little rigger brush out and adding some branches to connect a few of those that you can see visually. You don't have to connect all of them, but it's nice to see an occasional branch running through it to help remind us that it's leaves on a tree and not just blobs. Emphasizing a couple of the ones up here. I'm sorry that glare is so bright in that corner, but we will zoom in on it. And adding a couple more highlights across the top of them to help them pop out a little bit more, and low lights underneath them, and then adding a few more light, soft leaves around the top. So we have kind of two different colors of leaves up there, one that's more yellow and one that's more white. And then on the lower edge, we have some that are more green and some that are more brown, just depending. I try not to mix a lot of color at once because that means every time I pick up a color, it'll be a little bit different. Especially when doing landscapes or something that's very natural, I find that useful to not mix like a big pot of green and keep pulling from it, but to continually have to remix my colors helps me create more variation while I'm working. So I've mixed a brighter green. This one has more yellow in it. It's a little more true to like true green. I've put quite a bit of medium in it because I just want to softly tint some areas. And I'm thinking of it as a mid-tone. You can see where it's blotted on the side there. It's pretty translucent. To help bridge the gap from our brightest highlights and into our shadow areas. And then I'm scuffing it into a couple areas here just to help it show up also in the background colors. Mixing up a little bit of our burnt sienna and bringing that back forward into our trunk here because we've lost a lot of that underpainting at this point. You can still see it in a few places showing through in the modeling of the background, but I want a little more present in the trunk. That orange will pair nicely with the green and help it seem really vibrant, help it pop forward. And then I'm emphasizing those rim lights around the edges of the trees with a little bit of white mixed with yellows and greens and a little bit of brown, mostly white though, and just a really tiny brush and adding just really faint, soft little highlights around the outsides of things so that they feel like that's in the foreground, everything behind it is disappearing into space. And I think that's it. I hope that that helps. It's that little bit of like stippling and a little more painterly effect. We've certainly glossed over a few details, but the overall effect is really similar to your reference image, and good luck.